So we left off in lecture talking about axons. We kind of went through all the neuroglia cells, those nerve glue cells, and then the neuron. And I'm like, those are the basic cells of the nervous system. Now, we also talked in the neuroglia cells that there are two cells found in our nervous system that make myelin. If you're in the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes make myelin. And if you're in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells make myelin. Now, myelin is a whitish protein lipoid, so lipid-like substance. We find myelin generally around long or large diameter axons. If that axon has myelin around it, we just call them myelinated fibers. And usually long axons are called fibers, so we just call them myelinated fibers. Now, two main functions of myelin, which is why we care about it. One, it protects and electrically insulates an axon. Now, our next lecture we're going to talk about electricity in the nervous system. And so since we're talking about electricity, this has one of those functions that helps insulate electrically along the axon. Also, because of that insulation, it can increase the speed of nerve impulse transmissions. It can increase how fast information can travel along an axon. Again, remember, it travels very, very quickly. You see something and you can act on it. Now, that in part then, since it speeds up chemical or nerve impulses and electricity along the axons, a non-myelinated fiber then conducts impulses more slowly. There are places in the body where information doesn't have to travel very, very quickly, and we don't need the myelin around those axons. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, it's those Schwann cells that make the myelin. They wrap that myelin around the axon. It's called in a jelly roll-like fashion. If anyone's ever made like pinwheel cookies or anything where they had to roll it up, and they make myelin. They just roll it around and around and around, just like as if you took like an ace bandage and wrapped it around and around and around an arm or something. And that's how they add it on. Now, one Schwann cell forms one segment of myelin because they form in these little chunks, little Schwann cells make its own little Schwann cell myelin underneath. And so a myelin sheath is that plasma membrane, all the layers of plasma membrane around the axon with that myelin in between. This is showing how they kind of jelly roll like fashion. It just sits there and wraps, around, and it will continue to wrap around and around and around until you have a fully myelinated axon. And again, you have these little chunks. This is one Schwann cell, got a nucleus and everything, and one Schwann cell making one section of myelin around that axon. This is an actual picture of it, zoomed in 24,000 times, but you can see those layers of myelin around the axon made by that Schwann cell. Now, and the myelinated cells on the plasma membrane have less protein. Again, we don't want a lot of protein, mostly because a lot of protein that's on the cell membrane, a lot of those proteins on a plasma membrane are protein channels or protein carriers, moving stuff in and out. And sometimes it just happens by passive transport. Things just go across. We don't want them to just go across. We don't want a lot of these proteins where stuff can sneak across. Instead, if we get rid of a lot of these proteins along these myelinated cells, they become a good electrical insulators. We're going to talk in our next lecture about lots of sodiums and potassium ions moving. Well, if they can't sneak out because there's not lots of protein channels or carriers, and they have to stay in and become a good electrical insulator, regulating what actually does move in and out. Now, there are usually gaps between different Schwann cells where there's either very little or no myelin. Those gaps they're called nodes of Ranvier. Now, if an axon has an axon collateral, which just means it has a branch coming off of it, it would come off at one of these nodes of Ranviers. Now, a non-myelinated fiber usually have really thin fibers, not wrapped in myelin. They're usually surrounded by a Schwann cell. They just don't have the myelin. The Schwann cell is not making myelin. And one cell may actually surround 15 different fibers. These fibers are so thin, these axons, these really thin axon fibers, are so thin we can actually have one cell surrounding 15 different axon fibers. And I'm like, the Schwann-Still's just not making any myelin around them. Now in the central nervous system, different cell that makes myelin, still makes myelin, but it's the oligodendrocyte. And I'm like, they have these long branches that makes it. And I'm like, and it can wrap around 60 different axons at once. This picture is just showing 3, but it can wrap around 60 different axons, depending on how many branches are coming off that cell body. There are still nodes of Ranviers, and I'm like, they're just not shown on here, but you're still going to see them. The thinnest of the fibers, unmyelinated, don't need it. Now, places in the central nervous system, again, brain and spinal cord, where you have lots of myelin. Because this myelin is a whitish color, it's this whitish protein lipoid substance, because it is a whitish color, there are actually places in the brain where it actually looks like white material. We call it white matter. It's just where you have lots of myelinated fibers. And then there are places in the brain where you have lots of cell bodies with the nucleus and nucleolus and non-myelinated fibers. Because they don't have that myelin, it actually appears a little bit darker, and we call it gray matter in the brain. This is a zoomed in picture showing one of those oligodendrocytes, 3 branches coming off of it. Now these neurons that are sending information every direction, we group them into one of 3 types. A sensory neuron, because it sends its information from the sensory receptors, whether it's your eyes or your skin or wherever it is, and it sends it toward the central nervous system. A motor carries information from the central nervous system out to an effector organ. It's kind of like, we'll go back to the bear. You saw a bear. That was your sensory information. You sent it to the central nervous system for processing. Your motor nerves, they carry information from the central nervous system to effectors. Whether it's going to carry it to your skeletal muscle, whether it's going to carry it to, and I'm like, your heart, and I'm like, it's going to just carry information from a central nervous system to an effector organ. Now, most cell bodies, I was going to say, it also includes most cell bodies in the central nervous system. And I'm like, so where you find the nucleus and nucleolus. Then we have what we just call these interneurons. They lie between the motor neurons and the sensory neurons. And they just kind of shuttle information between, through that central nervous system. Usually we find them completely in the central nervous system. They're just they're kind of the in-between, which is part of the inter. They're kind of the in-between or the go-between between the sensory and motor. Just sending information from one direction to the other. Most of the body's neurons lie within, and I'm like, generally it's your central nervous system, your brain or spinal cord, shuttling information to and from. This is just kind of showing, I'm like, that some of these can have different types of processes. This is just looking at structural classes of neurons. And I'm like, we've got a motor neuron that can just send to muscle. I'm like, we've got, I was going to say, sensory information that can go from eyes to the brain. I'm like, more sensory information that can go from skin to the brain. And I'm like, some of these can go back, 2 different ways. And I'm like, or have different extensions on it. A multipolar neuron means it has multiple extensions, and I'm like, it can control multiple different muscle fibers. Bipolar, and like, it has 2 kind of directions on the end of it, so it can kind of send and receive information back and forth. A unipolar, which a lot of them are, it just says indirection, or it just says information. They're sensory only, and they just send it directly to the brain. The brain or central nervous system can figure it out what it wants to do, so it's sensory only. Now for the review questions. The nervous system has 3 overlapping functions. Which of the following represent a logical sequence of these 3 functions? So it's like, what is it doing? And yes, it's the yellow. We have sensory information. You saw the bear, smelled the bear, heard the bear. Integration, process it. Motor, let's do something about it. Now, while studying for an exam, you reach for a beverage. To extend your arm, your which nervous system is activated? And the one that can control skeletal muscle to reach for the beverage is your somatic. Again, it's under voluntary control. You can control it. Now, the door slams shut loudly and you flinch. After a few seconds, you realize that your heart is beating very rapidly and forcefully. This response is the result of which part of the nervous system? The fact that, heartbeat going really fast is your autonomic nervous system. A lot of times I like to think that autonomic sounds like automatic, kind of, and I'm like, it just happens automatically. You cannot control how fast your heart is beating. Completing the following analogy. Electrical wire is to electrical insulating tape as peripheral neurons are to what? So thinking of electrical insulating tape on electrical wires as this is on a peripheral nervous system, or peripheral neuron. And it's the Schwann cells, because we find Schwann cells wrapping the peripheral neurons, just like electrical insulating tape wraps electrical wires. And again, it keeps that good electrical conduction going. Each neuron in our body has a lifespan of approximately how long? It's an average human lifespan, however long that may be. The portion of the axon that communicates with the target cell. So what part of the axon? We're just talking about the axon region that communicates with the target cell. That would be the axon terminal, whether you've got one or whether you've got thousands at the end. They communicate with your next target cell. And the basis for differentiation between gray matter and white matter in the central nervous system is the presence of what in the white matter? What makes it white in the central nervous system? And it is that myelinated fibers. That myelin is that white structure, protein lipoid structure, that appears white in the central nervous system. All right, so end of here, and then we'll continue on in our next lecture.